Hello and good Thursday evening to you all. Welcome to Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight with me, Phil Gurski, president of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting and a former strategic analyst with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. For those who are returning, welcome back. If we have any new people in the audience, welcome for the first time. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute to like this particular YouTube channel, and if you're not a subscriber yet, I'd like you to become one as soon as you can. There we go. Let's cut the volume on that. Hope you had a lovely day today here in Russell. It was a beautiful 10, 11 degrees outside. The snow is finally melting. Yay! I've got rivers of water running down the street. I can see part of my lawn right now. So here's hoping I don't jinx this. But I want to start off tonight's live stream with, again, an apology for yesterday evening. We had a problem with the internet. It's one of the, banes, difficulties living in a small town. Let's hope that it doesn't repeat itself tonight. I sincerely hope so. Hello again, my friends in India. Welcome again to the podcast. I want to talk about a story that I came across this morning on an American website, and it's talking about a trial that is proceeding in Germany. And this is the trial of a German woman who left to join Islamic State. And she's been charged not just with leaving the country to join a terrorist group. She is being accused of murdering or being an accessory to murder of a young Yazidi girl a couple years ago. Now, if those of you who aren't familiar with the Yazidis, these are people that live in northern Iraq, been around for thousands of years. And I think I just heard thunder outside. Well, how can you get thunder in March? Oh, well, I guess it's going to rain. The story is that the Islamic State saw the Yazidis as almost like subhumans, and it would kidnap them. It would kill the men and the older males, and it was essentially take the women and the young girls as sex slaves. And in this case, in Islamic State, back in 2019, I believe, there was they had this German woman and her ISIS husband took a 5-year-old girl, a 5-year-old Yazidi girl, and in order to punish her for some kind of wrong that she had committed, they kept her in a courtyard in the bright sun during the day. And eventually the girl died of thirst. A 5-year-old girl was kept by this woman and her husband because they saw her as not deserving of human rights. Back in Germany, and she's been charged. Bring this up is that we have this really unfortunate tendency in the West when it comes to talking about the so-called brides of ISIS, the brides of Islamic State, that they're somehow victims, that they're somehow not responsible for their actions. I just saw a bolt of lightning on March the 11th, go figure, that they're somehow not as guilty as the men were, and that we have to treat them differently. There's a whole lobby group here in Canada, at least, that is trying to get Canadian women who went to join Islamic State and took part in all kinds of atrocities by that terrorist group to rescue them, to bring them home because they're stuck in these camps in northern Iraq or northern Syria with their children. To me, this is absolving them of responsibility. The bottom line is, and no matter how many stories you hear and how many accounts that you come across, 99.9% of the women who joined Islamic State in 2013, 2014, 2015 did so deliberately. They did so of their own accord, and they weren't duped. They were not cajoled. They weren't forced. And they should basically pay for the crimes that they committed. So I've got a question in already. It's about the children. So thank you. I think we have a first This what testing brand accounts. This is your first time. Welcome to the podcast, by the way. I hope you like it. My position on children, it's a very good question, has been very consistent from day one. The children of Islamic State should be brought home and brought home right away. They didn't choose to go join Islamic State. A 2-year-old can't make that decision. A 4-year-old can't make that decision. They're being held in horrendous conditions in refugee camps and other parts in Iraq and Syria, and countries that of which they are citizens, be it Canada or India or Germany or whatever, should move heaven and earth to bring the children back today. But here's a rubbing point for me. This is where I become very unpopular. They should be brought home and they should be removed from their parents, because their parents are obviously not fit parents if they took their kids to join a terrorist group. So the kids should be brought home and placed with extended family, or where that's not possible, in the care of the state. In other words, become wards of the state. The kids bear no responsibility for their parents' actions. The parents should stand trial in Iraq and in Syria where their crimes were committed. Now, this woman, I don't know how she got back to Germany, and she is standing trial in Germany. It'll be interesting to see how the trial goes. One of the challenges of doing this is that you have to gather enough evidence that will stand a test in a Western court. Courts in Iraq and Syria are different. And my position has been the more heinous of the crimes that these people committed were committed there. They weren't committed here. Ergo, those countries have every right to try them according to their own laws, according to their own practices. We have no obligation to repatriate these people, as some people have said. And I'm a firm believer that, in fact, if their crimes were committed elsewhere, those countries get first dibs. They get a first crack at it. So a few comments in already. How do you understand who's committed what crime in a foreign country? Well, that's the whole point, is that if there is any information that's available on the nature of those crimes, it sure as heck isn't going to be in Germany. It's not going to be in Canada. It's not going to be in France. It's going to be in those countries there. Ijaz comes in with an important question. Determining exactly what crimes you can link foreign fighters and brides to is incredibly difficult and a huge obstacle to obscuring justice. Absolutely. And this is the challenge here. And I don't know how many successful trials there have been. There certainly have been very, very few, if any, in Canada, of people who were convicted of crimes committed in Iraq and Syria or Somalia with al-Shabaab. And Bill chimes in. Bill was an ex-RCMP officer. Part of the challenge for law enforcement in Canada is gathering evidence to the standards of Canadian court. Absolutely. And many have pointed out that, Iraqi courts and Syrian courts don't have our standards. And that's probably true. I certainly have read accounts whereby these trials are held very rapidly and that generally guilty verdicts are returned. And in many cases, the people are executed almost immediately because they have the death penalty in those countries. And I don't happen to abide. I don't like the death penalty. But who am I as a Canadian to tell the Iraqis and the Syrians what to do? I don't think I have that right, any more than the Iraqis and the Syrians have any right to tell us in Canada what to do. So JB asks, does the opposite apply? If someone commits a crime here, should we keep them here and not extradite them to their country of origin? I'm going to punt that to the police. I mean, Bill, if a person from Lower Slobodistan murders somebody in Toronto, do we not try them in Toronto as opposed to send them back to their country? We always have the option of sending them back once the trial's over. There are countries with which we have extradition treaties. Once the trial is held, the person can apply, or the country can apply, to have that person serve their sentence in their home country. But the trial is held here first, to the best of my knowledge. And Bill says that's exactly how it happens. So why in heaven's name people are clamoring for these people to be brought home before they're tried? I don't get it. And as I pointed out, and I apologize if I'm being repetitive here, I don't see a lobby group for those demanding that child molesters in Thailand or drug dealers in Colombia who happen to be Canadian should be returned to Canada right away before they face justice in the countries where their crimes were committed. That's just the way that I see things. I think the law is on my side in this. And so Bill says they serve their sentence and then usually deported. So in other words, if you do commit a serious crime in Canada and you are found guilty in Canadian court, you serve your sentence here. And then because you're not Canadian, we can basically punch you. We can send you back to your home country. I don't see any difference with what's happening with Islamic State. I'm scratching my head trying to figure out why so many Canadians are up in arms as to why we're not doing more to rescue those of our citizens who thought joining Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or Hizb ut-Tahrir or whatever organization it was, they thought it was a good idea and we should move heaven and earth to get them. I really do fail to understand. So JB says, yeah, we do pay for them to be incarcerated because they're committed their crimes here. I mean, that's the obligation we have. The evidence is here. The information is here. The trials are held here. And if they're found guilty in Canada, they will serve time in a Canadian prison. And once that crime is served, then we send them back. So why do we bother with the first part if we don't plan on keeping them here? Again, the crimes are crimes under Canadian criminal code. If a foreigner kills a Canadian, why should that person on Canadian soil, why should that person not be tried here in Canada? Justice has to be seen to be done by Canada, by the victims of the family. That's the way the system works. And to me, that's exactly the way the system's supposed to work in Iraq and Syria. Anyhow, this article on this trial of the German woman in Germany having been accessory to the killing of a 5-year-old girl, which, by the way, was very frequent by Islamic State. We'll see what happens with that. So, our Ratnadeep from India chimes in. Where do we send them to? Where do we send them to? I can't read the rest of your comment. Bottom line is that I think that people who commit serious crimes should be tried in the country where those crimes are committed. I don't think that's rocket science. I don't think that's a complicated thing to ask for, whether you're a terrorist or not. So if you've just joined us, this is Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight with Phil Gurski. I am Phil Gurski, president of Borealis. If you're new here, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel and give us a like so we can get more people. Tell your friends about it. Tell your family about it. This is one of the few podcasts I know coming out of Canada where we've got a former practitioner talking about things like counterterrorism. A lot of the podcasts are by self-styled experts. Some are, some aren't. A lot of academics out there doing this stuff, but not many ex-practitioners doing this. So I want to move on to the next topic, but just a few more comments. So Ratnadeep says, where do we send them if their citizenship has been revoked? Well, you're getting into the case of Shamima Begum, which, if you remember, guys, was one of our live streams from last week, is that the UK government has taken Ms. Begum's citizenship away, which means she's essentially stateless. And if you remember last time, I said quite categorically that I don't think they should be stateless. I don't think a country should render anyone stateless. So the Begum case is a very complicated one, and I don't know what's going to happen with her. She should stand trial in Iraq for her crimes, but then what happens if she's found guilty? Well, I guess she'll serve time in an Iraqi prison and then not go anywhere else because she has no other citizenship. Bill raises an interesting point, and this is something we've come across a lot. It is interesting that they burn their Canadian passports when traveling to join groups like Islamic State, but once they get there, they cry, I'm Canadian, wanting all the entitlements of a Canadian citizenship. And Aaron says, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, which of course is what Justin Trudeau said when he became Prime Minister. And you're absolutely right, Bill. And we remember the case of Farah Sheardon of Calgary, Alberta, West Coast, Western Canada, who famously burned his passport in an ISIS video and essentially threatened to kill Barack Obama. Now, Farah Sheardon's dead, so he's not coming home anytime soon. We don't have to worry about him. But there certainly does seem to be a citizenship of convenience, if you will. They are happy to renounce their citizenship and then cry for it once they get in trouble. So anyhow, I don't think there's much more to say on this topic, guys. I think that my position is quite clear about what should happen to those of our citizens from Western countries or whatever who went to join groups like Islamic State and became terrorists and killed people. The people of Iraq and Syria have every right to see that justice is done in their country. The topic I want to pick up on tonight came from our podcast from 2 nights ago, since last night's was a little bit of a wonky one because of the internet went down here. And it was a comment made by Soul Crusher, and he basically asked the question, whatever happened to Sikh extremism in Canada? So just as a very quick review, in the 1980s, the number one counterterrorism file in Canada was Sikh terrorism. For those who don't remember, in 1985, Sikh terrorists in Canada who were from British Columbia put a bomb on 2 aircraft that were leaving Vancouver. One went to Tokyo, exploded on the ground, and there was a luggage that exploded. It killed 2 baggage handlers, so the airplane itself didn't explode. The other one exploded off the coast of Ireland, and it took down 329 people. And that was the single largest act of terrorism in aviation history prior to 9/11. So Sikh terrorism was the soup du jour. It was the highest priority for the Canadian government in the 1980s. And then it kind of went away. To the best of my knowledge, when I worked for CSIS in the 2000s, I don't recall there being an active Sikh investigation, meaning it had sort of dissipated as a priority. And you might think it's gone away, but it hasn't. So let me read to you from my recent book, The Peaceable Kingdom. If you don't have a copy of it, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com. You can order a copy there, as this book is self-published. And in my section on Sikh extremism, I do want to read you something. This comes from the 2019 report by Public Safety Canada. Basically, it's a report that summarizes terrorism in the country. Quote, some individuals in Canada continue to support Sikh, i.e. Khalistani, extremist ideologies and movements. This political movement aims to create an independent homeland for Sikhs called Khalistan in India. This was in 2019. 25 years after our India. 35 years after our India. So despite the fact that it's not a priority from a counterterrorism perspective, the Sikh cause hasn't gone away. It hasn't disappeared, which is kind of the theme I want to develop tonight, is that what does that makes a terrorist movement end? Well, ideally, if you're a terrorist, you want your cause, your grievance to be addressed. So if tomorrow India somehow miraculously granted the Sikh nation an independent land called Khalistan in the Punjab, one would think that the Sikh grievance would be over. They've achieved their ends. You could argue the African National Congress, which was once considered to be a terrorist group in South Africa, at least considered a terrorist group by the government, achieved its ends when it became the government in 1994 at the end of apartheid. Therefore, the ANC morphed almost overnight from a terrorist group to the governing party. That's one way that terrorism can end. The other way that terrorism can end, especially terrorist groups, is this notion, and it's called decapitation theory. That's not the same kind of decapitation theory that one recalls when one looks at people like Islamic State cutting people's heads off, or that guy in France. We talked about Samuel Paty a few nights ago, how he was decapitated by a Chechen terrorist. It's not that kind of decapitation. What this theory says is that if you remove the leader, you tend to eliminate the terrorist group as a problem. And I want to push back against that. I want to show you some examples from recent history where taking out the leader did not necessarily result in the terrorist group's demise. So one of them, probably the most famous example, of course, is Al-Qaeda. So in 2011, if you recall, almost 10 years after 9/11, U.S. Special Forces finally found Osama bin Laden in a home in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and they killed him. So it's like cutting off the head of the snake, right? And the feeling was that bin Laden was such a charismatic leader that, in fact, taking him out would mean the end of Al-Qaeda. 10 years later, in fact, it's almost 10 years to the day. It'll be May of this year marks 10 years since bin Laden's death. Anybody want to put up their hand and say Al-Qaeda is dead? No, they're still alive. They're very much alive in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 2019, American Special Forces finally located Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, and they killed him in a firefight. Anyone want to argue that ISIS is no longer a terrorist group 2 years after his killing? In fact, it's stronger than ever by many accounts, not just in Iraq and Syria, but all the affiliates around the world. You want a third example? Abdullah Öcalan, who was the head of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, was captured by Turkish forces in 1999. He's been in prison ever since, and yet the PKK is as active today as it ever was. If you look at the Turkish media, the Turks say that the PKK is carrying out attacks on a weekly basis. And one last one, which is a partial victory, there's a group called the Shining Path, the Sendero Luminoso in Peru in the 1980s. And their leader, Abimael Guzman, was captured by the Peruvians in 92. That pretty well meant the demise of the Shining Path. I have read about attacks in 2017, 2018, but it's not nearly as active as it used to be. So the bottom line is that even when you take out leadership, you don't end up with terrorist groups disappearing. Sometimes they're robust enough to last on their own. Sometimes another leader fills their boots. Now, sometimes that leader isn't very good. You look at the case of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was his deputy for decades. He assumed the mantle of leadership when bin Laden died. Ayman al-Zawahiri has he's about as exciting as watching paint dry. He has the personality of a doorknob, and yet the group is still thriving despite the fact that its charismatic leader, its founder, bin Laden, is pushing up the daisies, as they say. So even if the leader is not that great, if there are enough people that believe in the cause, that maintain the grievance, then they have every possibility that the group is going to survive for quite some time. Take a look at a few more comments here. So JB says, an earlier guest of mine, I interviewed Brian Jenkins many, many years ago on the podcast. Brian Jenkins, of course, is one of the deans of terrorism studies in the United States. He's been doing terrorism since the 1960s. Sorry, he's been studying terrorism since the 1960s. He hasn't been doing terrorism since that time. He made the famous claim that terrorism is theater. It's all about the audience. It's all about the message. And so JB asks, if they don't get attention anymore, will they end? Is that a way to make them end? Depends what you mean by attention. Now, obviously, there are some people that say you shouldn't mediatize terrorist attacks. You shouldn't name them. You shouldn't give them any kind of profile. And yet, there's the public's right to know, right? The public has a right to know, and therefore, that's why we talk about terrorism. This is why this live stream is all about. It's to have a dialogue on this, pretending it's not there, ignoring the facts on the ground. I don't know if it's productive or not, but it certainly isn't in keeping with the public's right to know. Ratnadib asks, does using military power to take down a group or policing end a terrorist group? Again, the Americans have been in Iraq since 2003, and because of the American presence in Iraq, originally to take out Saddam Hussein, we had the rise of Islamic State. First, we had the rise of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq, called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Then we had Islamic State created in 2014. So I don't know. The American military hasn't eradicated it. The Americans have been in Afghanistan since 2001. The Taliban are still there. Islamic State and Khorasan are still there. In fact, the Taliban are going to take over if and when the Americans withdraw. So no, having a military force there is not a recipe for ending a terrorist group, unfortunately. There's no military solution to this. Just a reminder, if you've just joined us, you're listening to Who's Terrorizing Who Tonight with me, Phil Gurski. We're talking about how terrorist groups end and what can be done to do that. And as we're finding out with most things, it is extremely complicated. So Aaron asks, it's kind of like the Hydra, where you cut off one head and several more grow. It depends on the nature of the terrorist group. Some become a lot weaker, like Shining Path. Others seem to thrive. I'm not sure I'd use the Hydra. Sounds more like a Marvel film using the Hydra analogy. Darlene, welcome to the podcast. I think this is your first time. Hope you become a subscriber. If a grievance is addressed, does a group normally end violence, or do they migrate to another grievance? You may have missed what we said earlier, Darlene. We talked about how the African National Congress had its grievance addressed, became the power in South Africa, and they became a political party. So in that case, it actually did seem to work. Zaki, I think you're new to the podcast too. Welcome. It's nice to have you here. Do you think the Canadian government is infiltrated by Hezbollah operatives? Wow. What a great question. We know that Hezbollah does operate at many levels in Canadian society. I don't know if I'd say they're infiltrated per se, but there's no question that there is a huge Hezbollah influence in Canada. When I used to work for the security service, we knew that one of their more lucrative activities was actually stealing cars and sending them over to Lebanon for resale. That was one of the major fundraising activities by Hezbollah, not to mention the large Lebanese diaspora here in Canada, of which some would be Hezbollah supporters. Bill talks about Afghanistan, and he says, when he was in Afghanistan, so just to remind people, Bill was with the RCMP. He worked as a police officer in Afghanistan, trying to help train Afghan security forces. He said when he was in Afghanistan, on the one-year anniversary of bin Laden's death, there was a coordinated attack on the European police's Green Village residential compound to honor his death. So we have Al-Qaeda, or at least Al-Qaeda wannabes or fans, celebrating bin Laden's death by carrying out a terrorist attack. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you that just because you got our leader doesn't mean we've gone away. We're still a force to be reckoned with. Okay, VN, I'm thinking you're also a new person here. Thanks, VN, for coming to the live stream. I hope you like it. I hope you subscribe to the live stream. One terrorist group that was successfully ended was the LTTE in Sri Lanka. Really good point, because in 2009, the Sri Lankan military finally put an end to the LTTE. Not that there weren't problems with that. A lot of civilians died when the Sri Lankan military did that. But I think you're probably correct that if there's any example of a successful military eradication of a terrorist group, it's probably the LTTE in Sri Lanka. The problem is, this is going back to Darlene's earlier point, if the grievance has not been addressed, and I'm sure there are Tamils in Sri Lanka who still want an independent homeland for the Tamils in the north, the grievance can resurrect itself one day. It can arise again. So despite the fact the LTTE seems to have disappeared in terms of its lethality, the numbers of attacks it carries out, I haven't heard of an LTTE attack in decades, or at least a decade. That doesn't mean the cause has gone away. And it can certainly be, it can certainly resume if there are enough people in Sri Lanka that think that the only way to get their point to achieve their goals is to use violence. So I wouldn't close that chapter yet, but yes, it is 12 years in running since the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, were a force to be reckoned with in Sri Lanka. Bill, yeah, great point, Bill. We're never going to bomb or shoot our way out of this. This is what I argued in my, just 1 second here. This is what I argued in my 4th book. I've lost count. An End to the War on Terrorism. We've got to stop seeing this as a war. There's no military solution to terrorism. That's not to say the military doesn't play a role, but as Bill said, we're not going to shoot or bomb our way out of this. Getting back to this whole Hezbollah thing, Bill also comments that the line between organized crime and terrorist groups is sometimes non-existent. Hezbollah is a very good case, and you're absolutely right. I made that point in a perspective that I just published today, I believe, on my website. If you go to borealisthreatandrisk.com, you can subscribe there as well. There's a piece I wrote today on when terrorist groups collaborate with criminal organizations, and Hezbollah is a prime example of that. Bill also says the IRA have essentially gone quiet, but they do have they do raise their heads once in a while. You're right. The IRA is also largely quiescent over the past couple of decades. But again, when we talk about grievance, what was the point of the IRA? Well, originally the IRA was fighting for an independent Ireland, an independent Republic of Ireland. They got that in 1921. But the other part of the grievance was, of course, the 6 counties in Ulster, what we call Northern Ireland. They wanted them to join the Republic. And as of 2021, Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. So the grievance is still partially there. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the IRA could resume activity because of the fact that they haven't regained the entirety of the Emerald Isle. 6 counties of the island are still part of Britain. So the grievance hasn't been 100% resolved. Ijaz says, Rand published a book on this subject, How Terrorist Groups End, which they argued that either they integrate into political processes or they lose significant members via police or international agency action. Yeah, true. And I do have a great respect for the Rand Corporation, but those are not the only 2 ways. There's lots of ways that terrorist groups can end. So yeah, some join the political process, like the IRA, which basically became Sinn Féin, like the African National Congress, which became the government. But I think that's an oversimplification of how terrorist groups end. Jazz also adds, they notice that religious terrorist organizations have lofty goals that prevent integration into existing political processes and therefore have unique staying power. Do you think the religious elements set them apart? Great question, Ijaz, and I think the answer is yes. So as somebody who worked pretty well exclusively on Islamist extremism for 15 years and having written 6 books on it, I'm a very firm believer that religious terrorism is different in the sense that your goals are not necessarily earthly goals, and your goals are not ones that could be reasonably met. Let me try to explain. If you're a member of the IRA, or a member of the African National Congress, or a member of the Tamil Tigers, the cause you were fighting for was in theory achievable. Britain could agree to give the 6 counties back to the Republic of Ireland. The apartheid regime could agree to step down, which it eventually did. The Sri Lankan government could eventually agree to make a Tamil homeland or a Tamil autonomous area in northern Sri Lanka. The Indian government could agree to grant some level of autonomy or independence to Khalistan and the Punjab. Those are achievable goals. Islamist extremist groups do not have achievable goals. What they want is complete domination. They want to create their versions of Islamic states like was happening with the Caliphate in Iraq in 2014, in which they subjugate everybody else to their rules. And if you don't agree with them, they kill you. And in their nth degree, what Islamist extremist groups want is world domination. And I'm not making this up like in a 1950s science fiction film. Okay. They actually thought that eventually their aberrant form of Islam would become world dominant. That's their end goal. That's completely unachievable. And as a result, if you can't achieve it, you either decide, at one point you're going to stop fighting, or you keep fighting until you do gain, the end sight in mind. And it's for that reason I don't think religious terrorist groups have the same motivations and the same openness to resolving their differences in the same way that those that have purely political goals are in mind. It's for the same reason that I disagree with David Rappaport. I believe I've mentioned him on an earlier live stream. He's an American academic that talks about the 4 waves of terrorism. How we have anarchism in the 19th century, followed by ethno-nationalist terrorism, followed by far-left terrorism, followed by religious terrorism. And David responded that eventually the waves will end and that religious terrorism is on its way out. I don't think religious terrorism is on its way out in any way, shape, or form. Certainly not based on what I'm seeing on a daily basis. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll notice that on a daily basis, I tweet about terrorist acts around the world, and 99.9% of them are carried out by religious terrorists. And 99% of those are carried out by Islamist extremists in March of 2021. Despite the fact we're being told that it's all about the far right these days. It's not all about the far right these days, not on a global scale. So, to the question about how terrorist groups end, we'll return to my stock answer. It depends. There are just lots and lots of shades of gray with this. And referring to Ijaz's comment on the RAND Corporation, again, I get real nervous when people try to box this stuff. And they say, well, this is the reality. This is what's going to happen. It's generally a heck of a lot more complicated than that. Anybody else want to weigh in on this notion of how terrorist groups end and why terrorists decide to abandon their causes? Yeah, it's an ongoing question. It's one that academics are still looking at big time. I do want to thank, I don't see Soul Crusher on tonight, but I do want to thank him for raising the point about Sikh terrorism, because it's a part of our history we've forgotten. And yet, when CSIS was created as a security intelligence service back in 1984, that was the counterterrorism priority. That was the thing on which the vast majority of people who worked in counterterrorism were focused on, and rightly so. As we saw what happened less than a year after CSIS was created, we saw the Air India attack. Aaron asks, we see signs when an empire is waning. Can we see the same thing for terrorist groups? It's a very intelligent question. I suppose a sign that a terrorist group is waning is that basically their activity goes down. And as it was raised earlier with the Tamil Tigers, we did see a decrease in activity. So the Sri Lankan military was having success at defeating them, and eventually it appeared to defeat them totally. So if terrorist groups are simply not as active as they once were, one possible explanation is because they're on their way out. Another possible explanation is that they're under a lot of pressure and are simply holding fire until such time as the pressure is taken off, and then they reconstitute. You could argue that when al-Baghdadi was killed, that we saw an immediate decrease, at least initially, in Islamic State activity. And again, if you look at the news coming out of Iraq and Syria, you wouldn't say in 2021, so 2 years after Baghdadi's death, that Islamic State is less powerful than it once was. It doesn't have the caliphate, doesn't have the geographical footprint it once did, but it's certainly as active now as it ever was at its height in terms of terrorist attacks. JB says, so I was on a podcast with Vosh, who's I guess a famous podcaster. If the goal is to remove a factory that pollutes your land, once you've achieved your goal, you have nothing else to fight for. Yeah. But terrorists aren't going to achieve their goals because their goals are unrealizable. They're unrealistic. Bill talks about the RAND report. How can it all be put in an ice box like RAND may be suggesting when we can't even agree on what a global definition of terrorism? Well, point taken, Bill. It's pretty hard to put a box around something when you can't figure out how big the box should be, what the sides, how big long the sides should be, and how deep it should be. VNS economic impact on groups can be a major cause I can think of. If the money dries out for them, religion would also lose the cause. Potentially, but I want to push back a little bit here, VN, in the sense that most terrorism is very, very cheap. Very few terrorist groups make money, like Islamic State did when they were selling antiquities on the market, and they're getting share of oil profits. Most terrorist groups are not in it to make money, and they don't make money because terrorism is cheap. When you've gotten to the point where any idiot in a van can run over people, that costs nothing. When a guy can pick up a knife and go into, like what happened in Finland recently, Sweden, which has not been called a terrorist attack yet, to the best of my knowledge, getting a knife doesn't cost anything. Getting a firearm, especially in the United States, doesn't cost anything. So, yeah, for larger groups, you need money the Islamic State needed money to run the caliphate. It actually had a government. It had, the various ministries that one associates with the government. But that's the exception, not the rule. Most terrorist groups don't operate on those parameters. So the money thing is not necessarily as important as you might think. So JB says, so does that make environmental terrorists less dangerous in the long run than the religious terrorists? Well, yes and no. If the world wakes up and pays attention to global warming and stops producing greenhouse gases, the environmentalists will say, well, we've achieved our goal. We don't need to use violence to further anymore. But if they don't, they might start blowing things up to get attention, to make their point, to put pressure on people. So Bill weighs in with the trend has shown that when the head of an organized crime or terrorist group is removed, there are others chomping at the bit to take their place. I think, Bill, we've seen far too many 1950s movies about the organized crime. I'm thinking of The Untouchables in the United States, that series that with what's his name? I forget the actor's name. And you're right. I think that when the head honcho was taken out, there's always a lineup of people that want the job. And we certainly have found out with most terrorist groups that taking out the leader does not result in the dissolution of the group. Talk about Sean Connery. This is the notion that these groups, they have a following, they have a cause, they have those people who believe in that cause, and as long as there is a cause to be believed in, there'll be people to carry it out. That should be the last message of tonight, guys, when it comes to terrorism. It's all about causes. It's all about grievances. And until you eliminate every single person who holds that grievance, the group has lifeblood. It's got a possibility of maintaining its actions. It has a possibility of sticking around and maybe even growing, depending if it can convince other people to share that same grievance. So I'm gonna wrap up this discussion on how terrorist groups end. It's been a very active conversation tonight. Thank you so much for everybody who weighed in. Nice to see a couple of new people here tonight. I hope to see you guys again. Hope you subscribe to this. Hope you give us a like on YouTube. I also want to recommend you look at the website that accompanies this live stream, borealisthreatandrisk.com. You get a lot more material there, a lot of blogs, a lot of podcasts, and things like that. Also, that's, as I mentioned, you can also buy my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, on the website. There's a link there on how to do it. And before I let you go, I want to continue this practice I've had for some time of sharing bits of wisdom from the world of fiction. So I believe I shared with you the Nancy Drew the other night. I want to go back to the Hardy Boys. Now, the Hardy Boys doesn't always have the greatest of advice, and I think tonight is a good example. This comes from a Hardy Boys novel, When the Clock Ticked. When a person introduces himself as Mr. Smith and then starts asking lots of suspicious questions about your family, it's a good bet that Smith is a phony name. Well, it didn't take the Hardy Boys to convince me of that. I think that's pretty obvious advice, Joe and Frank Hardy, but thank you for sharing it with us. Bill weighs in one more point. Sadly, I predict that anyone employed in the field of counterterrorism will be gainfully employed for a very, very long time. You're right, Bill. Counterterrorism is not going away. Terrorism is not going away. I wish I could say otherwise, but Ratnadeep in India adds, will fulfilling a cause and the activities of a group because some groups thrive on violence. Great question. I think there are people who are violent who are not necessarily terrorists. I think there are those that just like violence for the sake of violence. And I don't know what you know with those ones, but anyway, guys, I'm going to sign off for tonight. Just to remind you, we'll be here tomorrow at same Borealis time, same Borealis station at 8 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow, of course, is Friday night. That is going to be our Ask Phil night. So if you have any questions, JB says he already has a question for tomorrow night. Think about your questions for tomorrow. There's anything's on the table, and we'll certainly get a discussion going. Thanks again to everyone who came out tonight. If you could subscribe and give me a like, I'd appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your evening, folks, or in the case of India, you guys enjoy your Friday morning, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow night. You guys stay safe. Take care.